Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to week 2 of our COVID-19, the Mason Impact course. We're really excited to see you all back today. It's been really interesting to watch how our first week went and how many people were engaged in the conversation. And so, and we've got another fabulous set of talks this week. I'm really excited about that. I wanted to get a chance to go over a few updates for you. So first of all, many of, if not all of, your posts from last week have been graded. One of the things you'll see is that we're not turning on the grades until all of the posts in a single day have been, because multiple TAs are grading them. We want to make sure there's consensus on the grades before we turn the grades on. So at first you'll just see that it's completed, and then once the grades are up, we'll turn them on all at once for that day. Your grades, if you remember from the syllabus, are only graded in 3 ways. You get a 0 if you didn't do the post that week. You get a 1 if it was unsatisfactory, if what you wrote didn't meet our expectations. And you get a 2 if it's satisfactory. And sometimes you'll get notes in there that say either it was satisfactory and boy, howdy, did y'all do a fabulous job on this. Or sometimes you'll get a note that says you got a satisfactory, but you need to watch these particular things to be able to continue to get a satisfactory grade in the future. One particular point of that is there's still questions about citations. For the most part, y'all did a good job of trying to make sure that you were separating what's your work from other people's work in your citations, but there were issues in sort of how that was done. So there are 2 FAQs posted in the Blackboard site that when they were grading those, they reference back to those FAQs to be able to help you understand, because we weren't going to type the same thing again and again, but they give you additional examples of how to do it. The most important thing is to make sure that you're showing academic integrity. You're saying, as Dr. Lawrence said, this is something that I think is interesting and it connects to this thing I read, right? So you want to make sure that you're referencing correctly. A reminder that you don't need to pick a bibliography unless you're referencing beyond either the speaker for the day and the materials they provided. If you're referencing out to a New York Times article that you also read on a similar topic, then you would want to put a citation for that. So, so those are some of the important points coming out of those, but overall you did an excellent job. If you don't have any grades showing up for the week, you need to be in contact with the TAs by emailing impactgm@gmu.edu to be able to see what's going on there. And a reminder that you need to have 2 satisfactory reports or responses per week. We're going into week 2. You need to have 2 this week, 2 the next week, 2 the following week, and 1 the last week to be able to get a satisfactory grade in the class. So just make sure you're keeping up with that. And if you have questions, make sure you're emailing impact@gmu.edu. The other thing I was going to make sure that we do, and we're not doing it quite right yet today. Oh, we are actually beautifully, never mind. So one of the things you need to make sure of is that there are 2 buttons on the bottom of your screen. One is the chat function. The chat function is back and forth with the TAs, and that conversation is about functional things for the class. The Q&A button is where you should put a question specifically to the speaker about the subject for today. And so make sure that you are, and we're just going to be dismissing questions in there now. So we have several days of that. We'll be dismissing questions in the Q&A that are ones that are supposed to be in the chat. And we may remind you, if you're in the chat, that that's a question that needs to go in the Q&A. The other thing is you can keep asking questions all the way through the time that Dr. Lawrence is talking. But what's important is that you are, that you also are voting up the questions that look interesting, so that the most interesting ones are the ones that get to the top. And it makes sense to check too, to see what, there are 2 questions right now that are in the Q&A that should be in the chat. Make sure that you are checking to see if there are other questions similar to yours and voting them up. As we talked about with Dr. Cohen last time, there's actually a speed premium. If you're one of the first ones in there, then they get voted, they get more chances to get voted. So you want to make sure that you're thinking about checking to make sure your question hasn't already been answered and just agreeing with it to be able to make sure that your question comes up. So those are all of the most important points Of that, this is I mean, when I proposed this class, one of the things I thought we would be seeing is that we would be on, we've been working on it for a month to get this ready. I thought at that point that we were on a swing downward where there'd be fewer cases, and some of this would be a different conversation. We're in a really different place now. We've had record numbers of cases across the country in the last 2 weeks. And we are well beyond the peak that we had the first time. So this is not only relevant, but becoming even more relevant as we're moving forward. And I hope you're watching the news and looking at how the kinds of things that we're talking about in the class are evolving as we speak. There's not often that you take a class where the subject matter changes on a daily basis. And this is one of those times where each of the speakers is going to be talking about that as they're moving forward. And I really enjoyed, I was telling Dr. Lawrence earlier how much I enjoyed reading her pieces that were for today, the 2 background information pieces, the article about rhetoric and health and how integrated that is, and the other article about sort of misinformation and how it's being spread. And so it was a really interesting set of things to be watching. So with that, I'm going to turn it over. Dr. Heidi Lawrence is the Associate Professor in English, and she's also Director of the Professional Writing and Rhetoric Concentration in English. And her specialty is in rhetoric and health. And she's been active in this time and an expert that people have been referring to. So with that, Heidi, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I look forward to listening to you today.
Great. Thank you so much, Bethany, or Dr. Usher. Thank you so much. I really appreciate this entire class and the invitation to come and talk with you all. And thank you all 293 of you right now who are listening. I really appreciate your time. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen. I have some slides that we're going to talk through this evening. Okay. All right, so as Dr. Usher said, my name is Heidi Lawrence. I'm an associate professor in the Department of English. I'm also the director of the Professional Writing and Rhetoric Concentration in the department. Just a brief agenda for this evening. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about my work and what I've done throughout my research into vaccination controversy. So I'll start out there. I want to give everyone a little bit of background on the medical humanities and medical rhetoric, a little bit of which you got in that reading for this evening. But I also wanted to make it really clear to everyone participating some of the differences between high school English and college English and what you might expect in the English department here at George Mason. Again, it looks a little bit different than maybe what you did in your high school English class, and I want to give a little bit of context for that. Then I'm going to talk broadly about vaccine skepticism and how it works in both historical and contemporary context briefly. And then we'll get into a little bit more on COVID-19, how vaccine skeptical arguments have really inflected and informed our understanding of the vaccine or the skepticism to COVID-19, and kind of questions for what comes next. As Dr. Usher indicated, this is still an evolving issue. This is still a rapidly advancing disease. And so we want to think about what comes next and how can we prepare rhetorically for the arguments to come. And then obviously we'll end with some resources and questions. So I am a proud product of Virginia education and Virginia public education in particular. I got my Bachelor's of Arts at Mary Washington College in English. I got an MA in the very department that I now run at George Mason in professional writing and rhetoric, and I completed my PhD in writing and rhetoric at Virginia Tech. Go Hokies. When I was a graduate student at Virginia Tech, I first became introduced to the questions about vaccination that we'll talk about tonight, and this is a research topic. And frankly, I was new to it. I didn't really know what there was to be skeptical about when it came to vaccinations. I'd never encountered any vaccine skeptics. I didn't have children to vaccinate, so I didn't really have a context for it. So it was really similar to perhaps many of you sitting there right now going, vaccine skepticism, who would be skeptical about a vaccine? And so hopefully I'll be able to kind of reflect on a little bit of what I came to learn and some important things to know about that topic tonight. I've spent the last 10 years researching vaccination controversy using a wide range of methods from the humanities. I'll talk about those a bit more in a moment. And my single authored monograph, Vaccine Rhetorics, came out earlier this year, right before COVID. from Ohio State University Press in 2020. And at last check, there were extensive previews of a lot of works from Ohio State University Press available on their site if you wanted to take a look at that for free. Okay, so first, a little bit about the medical humanities. One of my favorite quotations that kind of sets the stage for what the medical humanities are appears in Catherine Montgomery's How Doctors Think. And it says, and this is in response to her daughter's diagnosis with breast cancer, "The lump is there. It is a sign caught in medias res, or in the middle of things, a clue to a natural history that is unfolding. Science describes and explains it and determines what can be done about it. But the importance of that lump, the acts its discovery entails, and what those acts will mean are social and cultural matters." And so we can take from Montgomery's statement that medicine has various facets. There's the clinical or scientific facet, the tumor, the virus, the artery that's clogged, the broken or bleeding appendage, the thing that's wrong with the body that medicine is attuned to fix. And that's sort of the thing we think of medicine all the time in sort of most standard contexts. We think of the doctor in the clinical encounter, in the clinical space. We think of maybe a scientist at a bench, right? That's medicine. But Montgomery's statement shows us that there's more to it than that. There's also the experiential one. This occurs in the psychosocial or the lived space of the sick person and their loved ones as they live with disease and treatment. And then there's also the social and cultural contexts that include things like media, cultural mores and values, popular discourses, corporate and industrial influences, or even policies that shape what health and disease are. And so the medical humanities are really interested in kind of all of those facets, but certainly those latter two in particular. What is it that people experience as they traverse medical systems? How do social and cultural mores, how does language, how do experiences with media or various types of experiences out in the world and as a part of a society and a culture, how do those influence and inflect your experience with medicine? And how does medicine respond in ways that are both helpful and move you toward a state of health, or maybe perhaps problematic and disrupt your experience and movement toward health? Medical humanists are researchers in humanities fields that bring those research tools to medicine and health. And so the humanities is a wide range of fields: folklore, history, anthropology, other types of fields like that. A lot of it includes qualitative research, though some of it is quantitative. And qualitative research might include things like interviews, observations, ethnography, or the study of people and cultures, archival research, textual analysis, narrative analysis, other types of research methods that are perhaps different than what happened in the social sciences or in the hard or bench sciences, to try and understand the world around us. Oftentimes, the work of the medical humanities is focused on the specific and the local versus the generalizable and the global. And you'll hear and across my work tonight, and maybe even saw some in the Derkach and Siegel piece, that's a really explicit goal of my work in particular, is to understand people's particular lived and specific experiences. So I'm less interested in what a big group of people across the state of Virginia or the world or the country writ large are worried about when it comes to vaccines. And I'm very, very, very interested in the dozen people in a small community who won't vaccinate against pertussis. That's the community that I'm interested in studying. That's really important actually when it comes to vaccination, because as we'll talk about in a few moments, vaccines work best when everyone in a population is participating in them. So even that handful or a dozen or 24 people who have a specific belief that means they don't vaccinate, they can actually jeopardize the health and the medical system that everyone participates in. So for vaccination in particular, humanities methods are really important to understanding why it is that some people are skeptical and refuse vaccines and why others do accept them. Then, moving out of the medical humanities writ large, specifically medical rhetoric studies language, discourse, and persuasion that happens in contexts related to health and medicine. And so again, hopefully you read the Derkach and Siegel piece where they parse a few important things. And this is sort of the last little bit of background I'll give you before we get into vaccinations. So remembering first that rhetoric has two kind of main connotations to it. There's the kind of popular meaning where rhetoric is meaningless language or fluff or puffery. And then there's a scholarly meaning that's actually quite different. The scholarly study of rhetoric dates to the classical era in Greece, where, although this is a problematic statement, the first democracy required different forms of persuasion in public spaces. And as problematic as our understanding of that classical era is, it was the case, right? This is a place where we have courtrooms where people need to be persuaded, in some cases in a novel circumstance in terms of history. We have a Senate where people are debating policies and decisions for whole populations. And so there is this new sort of need for discourse in the public sphere that can be persuasive and can encourage people to move toward mutually just ends. Aristotle and Plato kind of classically duked it out over the ethics of rhetoric and its appropriateness in the public sphere. My work falls out of the Aristotelian tradition, wherein the definition is rhetoric is the ability to see in any situation the available means of persuasion. And the significance of that definition is that rhetoric isn't just about persuading someone to do what you want to do when you want them to do it, but it's both analytical and it's productive. It looks at situations, it tries to understand what persuasion is and how it's happening, and then it also works to inform a speaker on how to change the situation, how to work toward more just ends through the production of language and discourse that can change things. And then you saw in the Derkach and Siegel piece that they take that Aristotelian definition and apply that and operationalize it toward rhetorical criticism, meaning that rhetorical criticism is who is persuading whom of what, and what are the means of persuasion. And so following out of those types of questions, people in medical rhetoric will track argumentative styles, types, arrangements, other types of tropes and things that are happening in discourse to understand how persuasion works. So that's some brief context on what medical rhetoricians and medical humanists do. And now I'm going to talk about vaccine skepticism. So again, if you were like me 10 short years ago, you may be sitting there thinking, what? People are skeptical about vaccines? I have all my vaccines. Who cares? And the truth is, lots of people have cared a lot over time. Vaccination is a multiple centuries old practice. The first vaccine was administered in 1793 by Edward Jenner. He sort of formalized a process of vaccination and preventing smallpox, although various methods had been used previously throughout history to try to prevent smallpox. But upon the development of that vaccine and its widespread adoption, right alongside that grew a really serious and strong skepticism and pushback and refusal of that vaccine. Throughout the 19th century in both Britain and the United States, you have widespread, very vocal and local articulations of skepticism against vaccinations. It's important to remember at this time, medicine and science didn't work the way they do now. There were no labs, there were no clinical trials, there were no sort of gold standard scientific practices that were followed. So vaccination was legitimately a much riskier prospect in the 19th century certainly than it is today, or even than it was later on in the process. Many people did become ill. They lost their lives. They developed serious sepsis. They might develop localized injuries on the site of the vaccination. So it was a really risky process. However, smallpox is a very serious disease that was highly communicable and very, very deadly in some of its forms. And so as that process became more widely accepted, localities began mandating vaccination and people began pushing back against it. And again, that's primarily the way that things unfolded in Britain and in the United States. In the United States, this kind of hit its precipice in 1905 with the case of Jacobson v. Massachusetts, which is a Supreme Court case that set the precedent for a compulsory vaccination in the United States. And what happened in that case is actually really similar to what lots of parents still say are happening to their kids today, even though it's not medically verified or scientifically verified. Henning Jacobson had been vaccinated in the past and suffered very severe, he felt, adverse reactions from the vaccine. And so when another outbreak broke out in his town in Massachusetts and a vaccine mandate was issued, he refused to have the vaccination and also refused to pay the fine, didn't feel that he should have to pay the fine that he'd have to pay in order to refuse the vaccine because he said, this will threaten my life. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and they ultimately decided that no, Henning Jacobson did not have the right to refuse that vaccine just because of his personal belief or personal concern about his personal health. That vaccines are about the public's health, and ultimately, this is what the case says, the public's health actually outweighs that of the individual. So again, that law, or that Supreme Court case, is really what allows the laws that we have in the United States today that require vaccination for public school entry. That's kind of the big threshold space where lots of vaccination, where we really make sure that our population is vaccinated, is school entry. Throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, vaccines continued to be developed. Significant public controversy doesn't really tick up until the 1980s. But in the 1950s, with the development of the polio vaccine, we see a really strong increase, or dramatic increase, in the number of vaccines that are developed and the frequency with which boosters and vaccines are required. So we have some interesting things going on throughout the 20th century that both kind of compel our culture and our society to want this technological response and prevention of disease, and sort of really be in awe of all of its abilities, right? Vaccines are really successful. We eradicated smallpox. The last vaccines were administered in the 1970s, and we haven't even had to vaccinate. We were able to take it off of the schedule because we just have no more smallpox. What an amazing feat for science and for humanity. It's a really wonderful story. We've also eliminated and greatly reduced diseases like measles, polio, and diphtheria because of vaccination. And so again, there's always been, or at least throughout the latter part of the 20th century and to now, this very strong component of the population that's very excited about this, that likes this, that knows that so much of what we're able to do in public life really relies on being disease-free and not having to have children especially suffer these awful childhood diseases. Now, it has even expanded across the lifespan. So we have vaccinations against flu, we have vaccinations for adults against pneumonia, we have vaccinations against shingles, right? These are all wonderful things that help people into older age prevent these diseases. These are great things. But as I said, although this sort of very successful and exciting and encouraging narrative has played out, and a lot of hard work has really come to save a lot of lives, they've always been the subject of controversy. And this, in my work, I've argued and studied that this happens for a couple of intersecting reasons that kind of form the rhetorical base for why it is that vaccines are controversial. Why, despite really widespread success and life-saving measures, why are we still arguing about this hundreds of years after we started? And so the first tenet of this is vaccines are given to healthy people for the prevention of disease, which is different than other medicines that we give. So let's say I have a headache and I take an aspirin, and the aspirin gives me a stomach ache. I might go, well, I don't love the stomach ache, but at least I don't have this headache anymore. So I'm kind of willing to make that trade-off. But a vaccine is different. Vaccine is more like when you take a vitamin and it makes you feel really sick. You go, hey, wait a minute. This vitamin is supposed to be making me feel better. I'm supposed to feel more energetic and more alive, or whatever the commercial has told me. And instead, now I feel really lousy. We feel really differently about that trade-off there. If I was healthy and feeling good and I took something that was supposed to make me better, I'm kind of only willing to accept getting better because I was already healthy. So that's sort of one of these components to vaccinations, that not only do we not want them to make people sick, but it also kind of sets the expectation for the public that they can only be beneficial and it can't have a negative consequence on health, the way we might be able to willing to accept a trade-off for something that stopped a progressing disease. Vaccines are given primarily to children. They're the key vectors of disease for lots of reasons. They also contract and can pass some of the most serious and life-threatening infectious diseases. And we care about them. We don't really want them to get sick, certainly unnecessarily, and with something that's lifelong and unfixable. And finally, vaccines require the highest number of people possible to get them in order to be effective, something called herd immunity, or the operation of a principle called herd immunity. And this is perhaps one of the most significant components of why vaccines are controversial. Vaccines certainly work at the level of the individual. If I get a vaccine and I come into contact with that disease, the vaccine will prevent me from getting it. But vaccines aren't 100% effective for everyone. Sometimes they just don't work. Sometimes people have waning immunity. Some people can't get vaccines because they have underlying conditions, or they might lose their immunity over time. So vaccines, to be most protective at the level of the community, have to include everyone being vaccinated who can be vaccinated getting the vaccine. That's That's sort of the way to maximize the effectiveness of the vaccination. So that means even people who, like Henning Jacobson, or even maybe yourselves at one point in time, think, I don't think I really need that. I think I might be at risk. I don't think I did well the last time I got this vaccine. They have to get it because that ensures that their neighbors or other people in the community won't get it as well. So it's sort of a group protection. And so the way that vaccine skepticisms get articulated is across a broad ecology. Now, there aren't enough PowerPoint slides and enough PowerPoint presentations for hours and hours of time to really cover every single skepticism or concern someone has about vaccinations. It's a very multifaceted issue. But in general, skepticisms fall across one of these 5 buckets. So the first is disease. When should you get sick? What's the value of getting sick? You know, some of us have warm memories about getting chickenpox as children and getting to stay home from school. Some people say, hey, yeah, I want to get the flu. I want to give my system a workout. I really want to make sure I'm a healthy person. I can get over disease. Those are cultural components to disease that make some people more willing to accept the risk of disease. Government. So when and how should governments get to mandate personal health choices? Going back to this question of the mandate, that's really we've been kind of chewing on since 1905. Religion. There are some religions that prohibit sort of the use of any kind of modern medication or any modern interventions in the body. And so that's kind of one bucket of religious concerns. Others involve, and many of you may have heard these or encountered them before, but concerns about things like the HPV vaccine that protects against cancer. There's a lot of concern, especially when that first came out, but it still persists about protecting children against a sexually transmitted disease and thinking about the behaviors of teenagers and things like that. So that's sort of another bucket of religious pushback against vaccination. Risk is another big one. So the risk of the disease versus the vaccine itself, how individual those risks might be, what those risks are. Is this disease really risky? Is this vaccine really risky? Am I at some sort of different risk because of my genetics or because of my microbiome or because of my environmental factors? What is the true nature of the risk of all of these things here, and what am I willing to accept? And then finally, personal responsibility. So what are our responsibilities to each other and the public health? Is it our responsibility to make decisions to protect our neighbors, even if maybe I could get the flu and I would be just fine, but my neighbor couldn't? And so should I sort of stop community spread by taking the vaccine? So questions like that. So again, there's a lot of diversity, a lot of people making a lot of arguments about vaccinations, but these are kind of 5 main buckets. And when COVID first started unfolding, the one thing I was seeing a lot, to the degree I could, because my 3-year-old's preschool was closed, so I was also like very inundated with childcare. But I started to see some articles and some news pieces come out where people said, oh, those anti-vaxxers, they're really going to want their vaccine now. We showed them, look at this really serious, scary disease. Everyone's going to be lining up for a vaccination. And I thought, I don't know, actually, based on what I know about vaccine skepticisms and concerns, I don't actually see that unfolding, and you'll see why. I hope this graphic shows why. So this is our ecology of vaccine skepticisms from just 2 slides ago, and we'll see that across these major buckets of concerns people have about vaccines, they line up almost identically to the big concerns we see playing out in the public sphere across TikToks and YouTube videos and individual experiences and news pieces, and even what the president has to say and the task force about what we should do in response to COVID-19 and how we should understand this pandemic as it's unfolding. So something like disease, we might say, you know, when should you get sick? Do I want to give my system a workout? Especially early on, and I think this is part of some of the early opening and the experimentation that's happening in some other states, is this question about whether or not we can just sort of all get COVID-19. Should we let herd immunity through natural disease kind of play out? Or should it be something that we all social distance and restrict ourselves from public life until we have a vaccine or a more reliable way of treating or preventing the disease? That's a real question that's, again, sometimes being asked and sometimes just letting play out in the course of things in the public sphere. Before I move on, I do want to give one brief caveat I should have given before this slide. I might talk about a perspective or a belief That doesn't necessarily mean I'm endorsing that belief. The work of rhetorical criticism works to expose and uncover, not necessarily say what's right and wrong. So I just want to make it clear that I'm not necessarily endorsing an opinion just because I'm talking about it. Government. So questions about government mandates and health. What's the value of expert voices? Should we even believe people in charge? All those types of questions that emerge for vaccine skepticisms have a nice parallel in COVID-19, where we're really looking at the value and the knowledge provided by the CDC and the task force. We're questioning the government's ability, both legally and then in terms of our values as a democracy or our kind of system of government, whether or not governments should be able to lock us down in the way that we have been, in the way that things have played out in certain places. Religious concerns emerged really quickly after lockdown started and religious services were stopped or put online. Lots of lawsuits emerged across the country, suing local governments, saying that their freedom of religion was being infringed upon because their house of worship was closed because of the government, and saying that the government isn't allowed to do that. Risk. So this is something we'll talk about a little bit more in a moment with Dr. Annie. But as a novel virus, as a pandemic, as something that's unfolding and there were a lot of unknowns, one of the big questions that we're still dealing with is, what is the real risk calculus? What is the real likelihood that I will get this disease? What is the likelihood that I will suffer severe complications? What is the likelihood I will die? We don't really fully understand those things, and we didn't in the early days necessarily. We're always collecting more data and trying to understand it. And then also there's lay understanding, this sort of idea that, the government is perpetuating one notion of COVID-19 that might not be playing out in every place in the same way, or might not play out in someone's personal experience quite in the same way. But again, that idea of differing risk calculations, right, drawing directly from vaccine skepticisms. And then finally, the issue of personal responsibility. What are our responsibilities to one another? If it's the vaccine, and for vaccine skepticisms, we can definitely see that with masks. We can see that with the measures that some people are willing to take in order to social distance. And then it really comes into contact with school. What responsibilities do schools have to communities to open in the midst of risk? What responsibilities do teachers have personally to take on this risk in order to sort of meet community needs and have children in school? Lots of questions there. So again, as I was thinking about and even developing this for this evening, what vaccine skeptics would do in light of a pandemic, I kind of thought, no, there's really not a clear way that they're going to all of a sudden be convinced that vaccines are good and great and be clamoring for them, because the nature of the concerns that people have about vaccines map really clearly from the vaccination discourses and persuasive tactics into COVID-19. And again, none of this is more evident than in the case of Dr. Annie. So as I said, as I started to watch everything unfold, especially on Twitter and on social media, I saw lots of anti-vaccine skeptics and advocates and activists on social media start to post lots of things about how the government regulations were unjust and inappropriate. And then I was alerted to the work of Dr. Annie Bukacek, through a reporter who reached out to me for an interview on her discourses. And we read the article, or perhaps you've read the article by Anne Helen Peterson for tonight. I didn't want to assign the actual lecture for you to go see, though some of you may have pursued it on your own. I didn't want to give the impression I was endorsing those perspectives, but rather so I thought I would sort of talk about them in this context and talk through them a little bit more here. So Dr. Annie's speech that's published on that's available on YouTube and was delivered to a small congregation in Montana has a number of different rhetorical features that are used to build to a very particular argument that she is forwarding, that again is something that copies over from vaccine skepticism and has played out in some really interesting ways for COVID-19. So first, Dr. Annie's introduction begins with a statement of her many professional credentials, all of her different degrees and society memberships and all kinds of things like that. She also wears a white coat and wears a stethoscope, despite the fact that she's obviously not in a clinical environment and doesn't need to be wearing either of those things. And in so doing, she builds ethos or credibility. One of the sort of main types of persuasion that we study in rhetoric are ethos, pathos, and logos. Ethos being credibility, pathos being emotion, and logos being logic or sort of factual appeals. And those are different appeals that people can use to make their case in various circumstances. Then she sort of, after she begins speaking, she starts with this assertion that she posted a question on Facebook asking people in her Facebook feed or in her Facebook universe, do you know anyone who has COVID-19 who was already a healthy person? And she says, she gets all these responses, but none but maybe 2 or 3 people, and all these responses that she asks for on Facebook say that there is somebody who's already a healthy person who has COVID-19. And in so doing, what she's doing rhetorically there is she's pulling in alternate forms of evidence. She's bringing in an anecdote from her own personal life and using personal reporting to try and undermine the larger clinical numbers that are being perpetuated or reported by the CDC and sort of mainstream media. This is a really common rhetorical tactic that's taken across vaccine skepticism and lots of different fields, where someone says, hey, I don't really know anything like this, or my personal experience really counters that. And sort of that can be almost like a pathos appeal to say, like, this doesn't match my felt experience. This doesn't match what I think about is really happening in life. Then she makes 2 intersecting arguments to undermine the government's access to data about the death rate for COVID-19. So first she says, truly, deaths from COVID-19, there's insufficient data and it's often inaccurate. And in this strategy, she's refuting the basis of the argument itself. So in the course of this argument, she's trying to say that the government doesn't really know what's going on with COVID-19. And she really draws it down to its most base form, which is how many people are dying. And she says, well, actually, the data that indicates how many people are dying are insufficient and inaccurate. She goes on to say that there's no universal definition of COVID-19 death, and that perhaps people are dying with COVID-19 rather than from COVID-19, which is a classic argument from definition. It sort of takes a foundational concept or idea, such as the definition of a death, what death even means, or using these qualifiers with COVID-19 versus from COVID-19 to, again, attack the basis of the argument that's being forwarded by standard medical officials. And then finally, she concludes that because of this definitional and basis of the argument is inaccurate and insufficient, we've overestimated the death numbers, leading to an unprecedented government overreach. And in that part of her argument, she's almost using a post hoc ergo propter hoc, or an after that, therefore, because of that argument against the CDC, saying, well, the CDC is saying that all these people are dying from COVID-19 because they happen to test positive they found out that they've tested positive once they've died. But no, they're not really dying from it. They're dying with it. They're actually dying of heart attacks or embolisms or aneurysms or these other problems. So there are people who are sick who are dying anyway. They just happen to get COVID-19 along the way. So this is the argument that she kind of falls out or completes. And so what Dr. Annie ends up creating over the course of this video is something we call an enthymeme. It's an argument whose logic includes an unstated assumption. So it attempts to make an argumentative circle, but there's something that remains unstated and thus unproven in the argument itself. So her argument runs, the nature of the deaths is lower than publicized. The basis for government restriction is the number of deaths, and therefore restrictions based on death rates are unjust. And her unstated assumption there is that the lack of government restriction is a just or preferred outcome. So again, hearkening back to these arguments forwarded by vaccine skeptics that governments shouldn't be able to mandate vaccines, that mandates are unjust, that people have individual responses to vaccines, that means that mandates are inappropriate for whole populations, all of those kinds of discourses that are already circulating for anti-vaxxers. Dr. Annie taps right into those to make a similar, but different because it's in COVID-19 context, argument about what's happening in COVID-19 and to then forward that argument against the government. So that's just one example of how rhetoric can be used to kind of unpack what's happening persuasively in a situation, and also to explain why there have been a lot of skepticisms in response to COVID-19 response, and why things aren't as neat as public health officials might often like it to be, and why people are not necessarily going to participate in a vaccine moving forward, because they're really tapping into all these existing concerns and issues that are going on. This is not just new stuff they're inventing. These are well-held, long argued beliefs and arguments that have existed among this population that need to be acknowledged. So final thoughts, upcoming questions, problems, and concerns. Will people get a COVID-19 vaccine? This is the big question and the big concern. So much of public health's unstated assumption is that everyone needs to get the vaccine, everyone who can get it will get it, and that will be our key to returning to normal. But when we think about what to anticipate or what to expect from a COVID-19 vaccine and how various populations will respond to it, the good news is we can learn from skepticisms that have been expressed from earlier new vaccines. And here I'm thinking primarily about H1N1 vaccine, which responded to the 2009-2010 H1N1 pandemic, which many of you probably have no recollection of, as well as the HPV vaccine that was first issued in the early 2000s. So those, the rollout of those vaccines and skepticisms in response to them tell us some things about how the public responds when there's a new vaccine. First, there are always concerns about speed. The idea that vaccines are tried and true, that they're tested, that they're safe and effective because they've gone through long-term rigorous study is sort of the key to why the public really trusts and buys into vaccines. And so when you say something like, we developed this at lightning speed, or this is fast-tracked, or other kind of speed discourses, that's going to actually create a lot of skepticism for a lot of people, because that will make them concerned that it wasn't fully tested, that it's actually not as tried and true as other vaccinations. And even people who might be willing to get the vaccine will be concerned that perhaps the proper safety protocols were not followed. Perhaps there are going to be lots of issues that don't become evident until post-licensure adoption of the vaccine. So there are all kinds of concerns about vaccines. Mandates are also very important to consider. Although it might be tempting to mandate a vaccine when it first comes out, we do know that people respond, even those, again, who are perhaps will support the vaccine or get it. There's often suspicion that arises if a vaccine is mandated too quickly. This happened in 2006 when Governor Rick Perry decided to add Gardasil, or the HPV vaccine, to the schedule in a very hasty last-minute decision that left very little room for people to refuse the vaccine. Just the act of doing that upset a lot of people, made them skeptical, made them think that some kind of crony capitalism or big pharma or some sort of financial motivation was really what the governor was after under that circumstance. So again, that can create skepticism even in a friendly public. And then finally, these questions about disease, understanding the disease severity, susceptibility, people's risk factors to disease. The more that we can know by that point in time, the more that can be communicated to the public about the real disease, or about the disease and its real risk and possibilities for susceptibility, will be really important to maintaining widespread adoption of the vaccines, or a COVID vaccine once it's available. And so I'll end with just a couple of rhetorical do's based on the past work I've done and thinking about this moving forward and how it's working. In the humanities, or in rhetoric in particular, we always recommend a working with rather than a communicating or legislating to. Rhetoric, as again, seeing the available means of persuasion, almost always works better when people are perceived to be on the same side. And so talking to stakeholders who are in communities that are anticipated to be hesitant, talking with doctors and developing a unified message, what they're comfortable recommending and saying to their patients, working with and alongside rather than, again, sort of legislating or dictating to, is going to have a more effective outcome, because the communication standards will be shared across everyone and everyone's voice and input will be reflected. Communicating carefully also, listening and acknowledging concerns and responding to the specifics of different situations are really key components to improving vaccine communication across practices and populations, but also expecting it to take time. Insisting on a very shortened time frame, mandating it, and then demanding people get it on a time frame that makes them feel like they don't have time to consider their options or really make an informed decision. Those things can be really damaging to how a population responds to a vaccine. And sort of correspondingly, rhetorical don'ts. Don't emphasize speed regulations or mandates. Those things, again, can cause skepticism even in a friendly public, but certainly among those who already have those skepticisms about vaccines that exist, if you amplify those and say, it's faster and you have to get it and you have no choice, that's only going to make people dig in more. And hard as it might be sometimes, just out of our own frustration or out of our own the walls that we hit when trying to communicate and persuade people, don't call people stupid and don't diminish their fears as irrational. We know from a couple of actually really great tested studies that when you try to actively say to someone, no, you're being irrational, that's a wrong thought, that's a wrong thing to think, that it just solidifies their belief more. That's a couple of studies by a social scientist named Brendan Nyhan. And calling people stupid, it's kind of a classic ad hominem attack from Rhetoric, which hasn't worked in 2,000 years. So it's not going to work now. So if even if you find yourself in in a position like this yourself, you're on Facebook and your aunt posts something, or you're talking to your dad and your dad says something, or even your new roommate, calling someone stupid or saying what they're worried about is inconsequential or not important is just not persuasive. You might be tempted to do it, but it's not likely to persuade them. Listening to them, communicating with them, hearing their concerns and their ideas is going to be a more effective persuasive tactic over the long run, rather than sort of punching and going in really hot, which actually might lose them or make them dig into that belief even more. Okay, and so with that, I have some resources listed here. I think I can, no, I'll have to stop sharing my screen now, but those are just a couple of the resources. If you're interested in this topic, these are some other books and some work that's from across the medical humanities, cultural studies, history, folklore, that you might be interested even just in checking out. Again, that sort of difference between high school English and college English. And please feel free, I'm looking forward to the Q&A, but feel free if you have questions afterwards. I'm happy to talk via email. I'm on Twitter, and you can check out my other work in other public spaces. So that's it. I will stop sharing.